Good morning, guys. My name is Sylvestre. I happen to be a surrogacy dad too. My kids are 2 and 5. I happen to be a doctor in real life. I'm an OBGYN and I work with high-risk pregnancies. So since I met my people here 7 years ago when I was looking for agencies, clinics, networking, I felt there was something to give back to gay people. Just my education, my personal viewpoint as a physician, also as a surrogacy dad. So it's great to be here. So one of the choices you're going to have to make is how to choose your egg donor. Now, I'll tell you a story that most medical students are recruited to be sperm donors in our early 20s, and I was one of them. And if you had told me, or somebody had told me, well, you can be a sperm donor, but you have to commit to meet your genetic children in 18 years. We want you to have a kind of a relationship or play a role in their life, not as a dad, but as a known entity, and we want to follow your medical history to see if you have Alzheimer's at 55, what's going to happen to your family. I said, absolutely not. So that's why to find an anonymous egg donor is actually logistically much easier. Most women who are egg donors are ladies in the early 20s, college, or somewhere in their life. No kids for the great majority, and they do this, to have a bit of income, and that's also that's a good thing to do for families. And if they'd rather not be bound to any kind of conditions to it. So, anonymous egg donor is the easiest way to find a donor. Wider selection, so that's complicated. And legally speaking, she doesn't know you, you don't know them. Who knows what could happen? An egg donor could psychologically say, oh, well, I have a child somewhere, I really need to know that child and to create a bond. So if you have a known egg donor, a person that you know, or a person that agreed to have some kind of relationship, to reveal some part of that identity to you and your family, so that creates potential problems in both ways. She might even want to meet her biological genetic children, and the other way around. On the other hand, a known person who gives a wider idea of who she is, you have more access to her personal history, her medical history, past and ongoing in the future, and she may agree to meet the children. In some countries, I think the UK, there's a rule that at age 16 or 18, she's not allowed to agree to meet her genetic children if they express the wish to do so. In most countries, Europe, it must be anonymous. Some countries that allow egg donation, because they don't, will allow it only if it's anonymous. So that being said, there are a lot of in-betweens. So for instance, we had an anonymous egg donor, but who agreed to leave a profile and a picture of her as a child in her current picture. Nothing that would allow me to recognize her on the street and say she is on a website, Facebook image, or a profile. But that kind of bio profile is allowed to me. In terms of choosing an egg donor and how criteria you want to choose to find the egg donor, we'll talk about it a bit later. But if you start by saying, I want an egg donor who has blue eyes, who's 5'8", who's from Scandinavia, who likes strawberries and color mauve, it's going to be somewhat difficult. So you have to have kind of realistic expectations. Let's move on to the next medical question about typical medical choices. So by the way, there are a lot more medical choices, so I'm just going to discuss a few. Fresh, shared versus frozen eggs. Talk about the color here. In a typical egg donor scenario, I know most of you are gay and you don't know much about the menstrual cycle, but women ovulate once a month, one egg, almost always. So when it comes to an egg donor, what you want to do is bombard her with medication to make it ovulate and produce between 20 and 25 eggs optimally. So these eggs are then retrieved via ultrasound guidance. And if you have the first cycle that you're going to do typically with the surrogate, you're going to cycle the surrogate with the egg donor so that you can try and attempt a fresh egg donor cycle. And if you decide to have a full cycle, you will have all the eggs. You and your spouse will have all the eggs. And if an option to save money would be to share that cycle. that if typically you have 22.5 eggs, typically about 2/3 of them yield good quality embryos, day 5 embryos. So you already lose a few in the process that will yield good blastocysts of day 5 embryos. So if you share half of them with somebody, and you and your spouse want to have children from each of your genetic contribution, so it's a bit of a rolling the dice, because you could wind up with 18 eggs, and you have to give 9 because you share a cycle with somebody of the 9, 6 fertilize, and then you have, if you want 3 children with 6 eggs, it's not always possible. So if you share a cycle and you want only 1 child, and let's say you're single, it might be logistically easier, might be possible, might be less of a risk than if you share a cycle with somebody, you want 2 kids and you have a spouse. Now, frozen eggs is also an option, is that in some circumstances, women give eggs and they're not matched to anybody yet, in particular. Up until recently, the technology was only good to freeze embryos, especially if you thaw embryos. But now the technology has improved that we actually can do the same with eggs. But we are not quite there yet in terms of the technology being successful in achieving good pregnancy rates. It's pretty good with frozen eggs, but not as good as frozen embryos. Now, the biggest decision you'll have to make is the one, am I going to transfer 1 or 2 embryos? That's a very, very big decision you'll have to make. Because of all the things you can control in the process of surrogacy, having a child, raising a child, the only thing you can control is how many embryos you'll transfer. The rest is like the laws of genetics, i.e. you have no control. So the fact are the twins versus singleton, the twins are associated with 3 times to 5 times the rate of cerebral palsy, perinatal death, miscarriages, mental delays, and difficulty in learning, and I'm passing others. And on about 15% of all singletons deliver before 37 weeks, which is the definition of term, and 50% of twins deliver before term. So obviously there's some consequences to this. We used to transfer 2, 3, 4 embryos routinely at the beginning of my training 15, 20 years ago because the success rate was so not good. And they're so much better now that it's a completely different animal. And also we have to remember that we are the best candidates for IVF of all the IVF groups because a typical IVF patient is 35 to 45 years old, has been trying to get pregnant for 15 years, has an underlying condition. So there's already something that is likely to make her less successful because the age of the egg is so extremely important. So when we're talking about egg donors that usually in their early 20s, a perfect uterus, proven uterus, you guys have perfect sperm, I'm sure. So this is the best possible scenario. So the rate of pregnancy is actually very, very, very high. So when it says transferring 2 embryos will increase the pregnancy rate, yes it does, but marginally. Maybe, depends who you listen to, the rate increased from 60 to 75% that you'll be pregnant within 1 transfer, if you transfer 2 versus 1. But then you come with a risk of twins of about 30 to 50%. So that's a high risk of twins. A lot of people do it because they think they're going to save money by doing 1 journey versus 2. I think in the short term, it probably is true in the short term. But if you think about what a gestational carrier gets when she carries twins, it's an extra bonus of somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000, depends when and where. There's almost a guaranteed C-section. She's almost guaranteed to be taken off time work, and you'll have to compensate her for her time away from work and to care for her children. So it will be a much more costly journey than a single time. And also one of the things is that emotionally it's hard to do surrogacy. I went through this twice, but I was also looking forward to do it again. The second time around, we did single embryo transfer for both, and we had a healthy son, and then 2 years later we wanted to have another child, and I already have a kid, it's already in school, it's great. You got under that pressure, oh, I've got to get pregnant right away, right now. It was just not the same. It's, the embryos are already created, so you don't have that cost anymore. All you have to do is find a surrogate. Sometimes it's the same one as your first. and do an embryo transfer. So in terms of cost, it's significantly less. And I was looking forward to do that journey again. I was looking forward to raise a child twice. And I raised my child, he was a baby, he became a toddler. I was looking to do it again. To do it twice at the same time, I'm not saying it's not fun. It must be very, very fun to raise two kids at the same time, exactly the same age, but also it must be pretty exhausting. Oh, by the way, the rate of divorce is, I think, a third higher in twins versus zero. So now, in terms of screening the embryos, that's something you hear about: Ph.D, PGS, CCS, pre-implantation genetic screening, and now more recently, it's comprehensive chromosomal screening. Essentially, to make a long story short, is screening the embryos genetically before they're implanted. Now, most of your straight friends, when they try to conceive, they don't get pregnant the first time or the first month. Most conceive within 6 months, not all of them, and most, 80 to 90% within a year, because most of the embryos created in nature and also in vitro are chromosomally not perfect. So this is why you have failed IVF cycles. So what some scientists think is that by taking a biopsy, more recently the technology is that you biopsy the blastocyst, which is day 5 embryo on day 5, and you analyze all the chromosomes for most of the malformation that can happen in terms of numbers of chromosomes, in terms of the way the genes are arranged within the embryos, you can increase the pregnancy rate. Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, you guys, as I said before, have the best prognosis in terms of implantation. So it might increase the pregnancy success of IVF, but really not all that much, because we're already very, very good in our setting. So CCS or PGS, the American Association for Society of Reproductive Medicine, says everybody who's over 35, we have multiple IVF failures, should be offered pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or CCS. But in our group, it's really not uniformly done. I know it's going to be offered to you, but if you think, oh my God, my journey is going to be successful the first time, automatically because I did CCS, well, don't be so certain, because first of all, your chances are already very good. And you might increase your rate of pregnancy by just a little bit, if at all, honestly. And it's a process that costs somewhere between $4,000 and $8,000 to add to the whole process already. So it's very, very costly. And finally, after you do your attempts, you usually have embryos, multiple embryos that are left. So most of you will freeze the embryo for future use. In case this pregnancy attempt does not work, or in case it works and you want some kids down the line. So now I'll pass it on to Greg to go on with how to choose in terms of family vision and personal preferences.
So shifting a little bit to more of the kind of psychosocial decision points in this process, I just want to say I remember being here 4, 5, and 6 years ago at this conference and sitting in your seats and having already done a lot of research, having already given a lot of thought to this. I remember thinking about having kids when I was a kid, So I imagine that whether you're an individual or a couple going through this process, you probably have already given a lot of thought to these things. But if you haven't, here are some things to consider from kind of more of a psychosocial perspective. And the left column is focused more on kind of, as an individual or as a couple, what are some of your personal values or preferences for what you want your family to look like? How many kids do you want, for instance? What are your thoughts about singletons versus multiples? George has offered some compelling reasons for singletons, but maybe you really want multiples, and that's just part of your decision-making process. And then, how many surrogacy journeys do you want to undertake? My husband and I had 2 separate journeys, fortunately with the same surrogate, so there was some consistency there. But both journeys entailed a lot of the same kind of decision points, a lot of the same personal questions that we had to answer for ourselves. And I think, again, just speaking to the number of resources here today, hopefully you'll have some feedback and guidance on those decision points. Another big question to ask yourself is, who is the bio dad? If you're an individual, that decision's been made for you, right? If you're a couple, who is going to be biologically connected to the child or children, and what goes into making that decision. And then I think one of the biggest kind of questions, if you've chosen surrogacy, again, whether it's traditional or gestational, is what do you imagine that relationship with your surrogate to look like? And I think that one thing that I really have learned personally, but I think also professionally, is that this process really requires some amount of flexibility. There's so much of this process that is outside of your control, and that really just kind of evolves, perhaps in this organic way that you weren't anticipating it to evolve. So one thing that I really encourage you to think about is just how all of these decision points, maybe just to make some room, build in some room for some flexibility in these choices. The right column is more focused on kind of what you're looking for in your work with an agency or in your independent journey. One of the questions to ask yourself is kind of how much risk are you willing to assume, particularly financially, with this process? We really want to encourage you to be educated consumers as you're talking with providers today and learning more about what kinds of a la carte or kind of packages they offer you. There are sort of typically a range of options as to whether or not everything is going to be kind of a single cost, or whether there's going to be a total package that maybe offers you a guarantee that you're going to have a successful pregnancy, after 3 tries. In addition to that, there's kind of varying degrees of hand-holding. Again, whether you work independently or with a provider, you have to ask yourself, how much support do we want during this process? Do we want to do this ourselves and go along kind of independently? Is there some kind of full service support they're looking for that will kind of take care of everything along the way, or somewhere in between? And then lastly, kind of what is your timeline and your financial kind of circumstances, and how do those two factors play into how you're going to create a family? I think that there are lots of ways to move through this process and lots of ways to craft your own journey. The thing that I really encourage you to think about is how no one journey is going to be right for another individual or couple. So you may feel kind of pulled to really follow in the footsteps of maybe another family that you saw created by gay dads. You may feel really pulled to go in the direction of a certain medical or professional recommendation or legal recommendation. I think ultimately you really have to make these personal choices based on your values, based on your individual preferences. But there are just some general recommendations that I think we would offer in terms of creating kind of a smoother process. One is to really think of your surrogate in the most kind of excited but also kind of compassionate way. She's clearly not a service provider. She's a human being who's helping you to create your family. And I think that the more you can kind of cultivate a relationship with your surrogate that feels good to you, but also that kind of acknowledges that amazing role she's playing in your life, the smoother the journey will be. Similarly, her entire family, in some cases, her entire community is a part of this process, or maybe a part of this process. And so I think it's really important to be mindful that this is not just an individual that you're going through this process with. This is actually, maybe she most likely will have children of her own, a partner. We've often had people who rely on extended family as a surrogate, or even their faith communities or other kind of communities in their area. And so I think you have to just be mindful of kind of, it's not just the surrogate who's going through this. The more that you kind of have those kind of considerations in mind, the more likely you are to have kind of a collaborative relationship that's going to, I think, encourage her motivation for the process. I think it's really important. We didn't expect to develop the relationship with our surrogate that we did, but we, visited her regularly. We still see her She carried our daughter, who's 2.5, and our son, who's 4 months. And we still send her pictures, we still talk on the phone occasionally. And we had this relationship that we never really thought we would have with her, but it just developed into something that we thought was really meaningful in our lives. So again, I think it's important to sort of resist this temptation, maybe to try to control the process and be very rigid, maybe about how things look, and create some flexibility for these choice points. As individuals, or as a couple going through this is an incredibly stressful journey, right? And so whether it's the financial strain or just kind of all of these decisions that you have to make as an individual or as a couple, there is a great deal of stress associated with this process. And I think one of the other stressors is that I would imagine that most of you don't really have models for this except for maybe friends who've gone through it. It's not like as gay men we saw our parents go through, as gay dads creating surrogacy, creating us through surrogacy. So I think one of the stressors is also just the lack of being able maybe to relate to people who are not going through the process. So it's really important to develop allies as well as kind of individual support for yourself and your partner. It's important maybe to acknowledge that your friends and family just may not really understand what you're going through and may not be the source of support you imagine they would be. And so just looking outside of those kind of communities to find other ways to support yourself. And I know that I work with a lot of individuals and couples going through this process. A professional is certainly someone who can be very helpful to help normalize your experience and to also kind of cheerlead you through the process.